All right, Krishna, everyone. This is acyuta-bhava. Today, I'm taking another question in my Bhakti Q&A series. This one's really good. I really enjoyed this one. Thank you to the woman who submitted it. She wrote this. I was wondering if you could expand upon the notion of Lila, the idea that, as I understand it, earthly existence is a sort of sacred play to which souls and source bear witness. You mention it often in your videos, and as someone who worked in theater for several years, I have found the idea really compelling. And of course, then I also get kind of stuck in it. So before I go further into the question, let's break down like what is this concept of Lila? So Lila essentially means play. And when we enter into spiritual life, then we are able to enter into the divine Lila or the divine pastimes or play of God. That does not mean that creation itself, material creation itself, is the same as divine Lila. It requires a shift in consciousness. In Bhakti, we say that it requires Krishna consciousness. Someone, in the Christian mystical tradition might say it requires Christ consciousness. Why do we study astrology, for example? So that we can learn to appreciate the divine play rather than getting caught up in the literal and separative kind of concrete materialistic jungle of experiences that is sometimes called Maya, which means illusion. So when we're talking about Lila, what we're talking about is really how do we enter into seeing God in everything, and therefore seeing that everything is at play in God. Everything is at play in the fields of God. So that's not something, and really that's the truth. That's the truth of what's happening. So in a sense, creation is just that. But there's also this dimension of our experience that can get really entangled in the illusion that everything or anything is apart from God, that I'm my own little creator, my own little ego king in the center of everything. And when I live from that kind of consciousness, then I'm not in a playful state. I'm in kind of a nightmare. So that's just kind of a quick definition of Lila, but let's go on because the question's really interesting. It keeps going from here. I experienced some tension that I haven't fully sorted out in the paradox that life is Lila, play, and yet what the soul is doing here is a kind of challenging work, the work of awakening. Yeah, so the tension would be natural because the more that we awaken, the more that we understand that there is this tension, that for slumbering souls like ourselves or others that we see in the world, we're not experiencing the play. We're experiencing being bogged down in pain and suffering and impermanence and the inability, the covering of our consciousness by illusions. So in that sense, there is this built-in tension that if we're not aware of the divine play, it's hard to see. And when it's hard to see and we're covered by it, but learning to come out of it, it feels like pretty topsy-turvy at times. Awakening is a process where it's like, it's like even though creation is this beautiful divine Lila, we're suffering pretty deeply without awareness of that. And so that's another truth. That's another reality. Even though it's an illusory reality, it's still real. It's still real to be in pain and ignorance of what is real, which is God's love and God's playfulness in creation. So that's probably why you haven't sorted out the paradox, because life is play, but not unless we're awakened, and we're not. So it is challenging work to awaken, but that doesn't mean that it's a funny thing, because the more that we evolve in our spiritual path, all the great Bhakti sages talk about this, that we go from the work, the anarta nivritti sometimes is called, which is like the removing of blockages in the heart through the chanting of the holy names. So we chant the holy names and we remove those blockages, and gradually we enter into the play. And as we do so, our perception of the work itself changes into play, even though it's still difficult. Just like actors on a stage may be completely absorbed in a scene of grief or tragedy or something very difficult, and yet they're aware of the fact that it's play and they relish it. So that starts to happen even though the work continues. And so we don't want to resolve that. It's not a contradiction. It is a paradox. And paradoxes don't need to be resolved. They just need to be lived into in Krishna consciousness, if that makes sense. Not that I'm any master of this, but these are just, my nuggets of insight that I've gained from my teachers and from my own, I guess, just experiences, walking this path. You go on to say, this person does, reflecting on this tension brought me to a more specific question. What is the role or use of small p play or sport, or I guess more broadly, art and story inside the larger Lila? Maybe trying to think of play, fun, and joy in terms of its function is just totally missing the point, but I keep coming back to it. The artist part of me wants to tell the part of me writing this question to shut up right now, but I think I'll forge on. I don't disagree with the idea that art feeds the soul, or the Aristotelian framing that a play is used to instruct and delight. But I guess these ideas are so familiar that I go numb at them now, or they feel unspecific. And I'm wary of the ways an attachment to entertainment can veer into escapism and illusion. But at the same time, I have had powerful, affecting, briefly transcendent experiences of play that I think came in part from moments of immersion in the illusion, the plot, or the game. I feel like in today's world, there's plenty of visible evidence and hard data on what play can do for the ego or the psyche, but I wonder what play or sports does for the soul, if anything. If the answer is just, again, to feed it, I can sit with that for longer. Like I said, I could probably go on here, but I'll stop for the moment. Great question. Wow, what a profound question. So, different philosophers have tackled the purpose of art, sport, in different ways. And what I can tell you is that if we read the pastimes of Krishna in the Bhagavat Purana, Krishna is very competitive. He likes to wrestle. He's constantly playing sports with his friends. He is also, he dresses up. And there are literally stories about, the six Goswamis and some of the earliest sort of progenitors of Bhakti yoga since, say, the last 500 years of the Bhakti movement as we now know it, since a great prophet whose name was Lord Chaitanya came in Bengal. These Goswamis wrote plays, and they wrote plays about Krishna or about God and about God's play. And, it's kind of like, it's like we like to reflect upon reflecting. And there's nothing wrong with that. For example, I once heard someone, it was really interesting, talk about one of the things that men do in intimacy, which is that men will tend to reflect upon the image of themselves being intimate with their partner while they're being intimate. And that men tend to be much more visually stimulated. And so the visual as a source of pleasure for men, and this is maybe kind of generic, maybe everyone does this, but this is just what I'd heard someone saying, that the man will get a lot of pleasure from the visual while he's actually being intimate with his partner, that he'll be reflecting on it and replaying it while the visual is actually there. Like, why would you do that? And I don't think that this is just because someone is dissociated, escapist, fantasy, not present in their body. I mean, it could be that. But there's something when I heard that, and I just thought that's a lot like Bhakti. I mean, as Lord Chaitanya, this great Bhakti prophet, God comes into creation essentially so that he can taste what it is like to be a lover of God. And so in Bhakti, there's always this awareness of how good it is to taste the taste that we are tasting, to for God to experience itself through the lover of God. This is why we have a tandem in Bhakti of Krishna and Radha. And so for me, the role of art, I mean, Bhakti is the yoga of art, of music, of dance, of color, of texture, of sound, of food, because everything is seen in relation to God. And if it's sanctified as an offering to God, if we're dancing for God, if we're writing poetry for God, who else is really a lot like this? Sufis. Great poets, the Sufis, great musicians. So the relishing of divine sentiments about experience itself, when it's seen in the light of God, is like an essential part of Bhakti yoga. And so when you go to temples, Bhakti temples, you'll see the kids doing plays where they reenact Krishna's Lila. Well, why are we reenacting? Is it just because, like, well, historically that's what happened and this is the doctrine, and so we need to know the doctrine, so we do the play. I mean, I remember it kind of being like that in Sunday school, like, okay, we're doing the Christmas pageant because we all need to know that Jesus was born and there was a donkey, and like that. But the way I've understood this is more like, no, we're entering into the story and myth and metaphor and symbol and image are the playground of the soul. James Hillman, the famous archetypal psychologist, said that if you want to know the soul, get to know images, because the soul is an image producing being. God is an image producing being insofar as we are all made in the image of God. And then we in turn like to reflect upon images of God, and God likes to come into us and reflect upon us reflecting upon God. So I know that sounds kind of like esoteric and crazy, but the truth is that if you go to a theater program, like I'm thinking, for example, of like when I was a kid, why did I love Star Wars so much? I would sit and I would just relish these characters and these teachings about the Force. And, it really captured my imagination. It wasn't just instructional. It wasn't just meant to delight. It didn't really serve a function. It was an end unto itself, but it was an end unto itself that captured soulful images that have this kind of timeless relevance. And then we take those images into life and we see them. I would see the Force in different things. And in a sense, like, thank God for Star Wars, because I'm not sure if I really would have taken to Christianity if it weren't for the fact that I was able to bring Christianity into Star Wars, or see Star Wars in Christianity. My dad helped me with that. So I think that's sort of the great thing about Bhakti is that Bhakti is literally like the playground for the artist, because all we have to do to make things, the little p in life, play, is to realize that life itself is a play. And sometimes we want to reflect upon the fact that life itself is a play, and we do so with little p play. But Krishna does so too. That's not just some defect in us. If we're doing it with God consciousness in mind, if we're doing it with a sense of devotional spiritual reverence in mind, when we play, how we play, or even how we're an artist. For example, George Harrison from the Beatles, fantastic devotional rock star. If we're doing it with that kind of consciousness, then it's not like it's just some escapist illusion, or it has to serve some kind of function, or no, it's Bhakti. Bhakti is just remembering God in anything that we do, whether we're small p playing or living out some great work in our lives. I mean, in a sense, that's why our spiritual practice becomes so much freer, and we start to experience the Lila the further we go, because we realize even that hard work of awakening is play. We start to see that the farther we go with it. And that's when the spiritual awakening becomes really lucid, and we don't desire for it to be over. We don't want to awaken to some state where we stop playing. We want to keep going. There's nowhere else we'd rather be. When Lord Chaitanya comes into, this is the Lord coming into human form in our Bhakti tradition that I practice. And what does he say? His only prayer that he leaves behind, he speaks as though he's just a regular old fallen soul. And he says, he's God praying to God. And he says, just, throw me wherever you want to throw me. Just let me keep engaging with you. Let me keep serving you. Let me keep remembering you. I don't care where I go. I don't care what comes next. I don't care what goal I'm going towards. I'm not worthy of any of that stuff. Just let me keep playing with you, is essentially the message of the only prayer he wrote. And that's God talking to God. So think about that for a second, right? So the small p play, if it's done in Krishna consciousness, is Bhakti. And Bhakti is its own goal. Bhakti comes from Bhakti, and Bhakti is aimed at Bhakti. We play to play. And it doesn't matter if it's small p or big P. I hope that this helps. Again, these are just kind of my enthusiastic ramblings, but hopefully they serve a good purpose here. And thank you for such a great question. If you guys have any questions, feel free to email me, info@nightlightastrology.com. Put Bhakti Q&A in the subject line. Let me know your thoughts. Take it easy. Hare Krishna.